Just let me know when I will.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new installment of our department's research seminar. That's the Department for Theoretical Philosophy at the University of Bucharest. And the research seminar is organized jointly with CELFIS. That's the Center for Logic, Philosophy, and History of Science at the University of Bucharest, and the CUB. That's the Research Center at the University of Bucharest, and specifically the Humanities Division. I'm delighted to be able to proctor this seminar speaker series via a postdoctoral project funded by WFISCDI. That's the local public funding agency for research. And the project via which this speaker series is funded is PN-3 Roman dash P1-1.1-PD-2019 0535, and we're very grateful to our public sponsor. And tonight's speaker is Tadeusz Ciecierski. Tadek is a wonderful researcher and friend. He's a fantastic explorer of demonstratives and indexicals, and tonight's talk is titled Demonstrative Uses. Professor Ciecierski is coming from the University of Warsaw, and we're delighted that he's been able to join us. Tadek, please take it away.
Thank you, Andrei, and thank you everybody for being present here. So before I begin, maybe just one word of introduction. This is the material I'm going to present for the first time ever, and this is a work in progress. So all feedback is very welcome. It will make me, it might make me stop going into wrong directions, wrong philosophical directions in general, but I haven't yet tested the material yet with an audience, so it might happen that it will be too short or too slow. I don't know that yet. So at some point, Andrei, if I will be talking too long, just let me know that, okay? And I will stop because I would like to get engaged in the discussion at some point because I'm very interested in the feedback and comments. Okay, so thank you. I don't know how much time is the usual time for the presentation. Are there any general rules during the seminar?
It's really up to you, but if you can squeeze it down to 30 to 45 minutes, that'd be ideal.
Wonderful. So would you be so kind just to let me know, let's say after 35 minutes that it's 35 minutes, okay? So I will, then at that point I will know, do I have to speed up somehow or do I have enough time? Okay, so that would be very helpful. So thanks. Okay, so let me begin. So as you can see, and as already Andrei introduced the topic at the very beginning, the title of my talk is Demonstrative Uses. So I'm not sure whether all people at the audience are very much into the philosophy of language and topics connected with context-sensitive expressions. So my experience usually is that the audiences are sometimes very divided in that respect. So if anything will be unclear at any point of the lecture or something would require an explanation, just stop, don't hesitate to stop me and let me know. I will be more than happy to explain something, to provide definitions and other things, okay? So let me just begin. So the plan of the talk looks as follows. I will start the talk with a brief discussion of various taxonomies of deictic expressions. Then I will formulate something that I'm calling this during this talk Smith's observation, and I will discuss how this observation is related to the taxonomies of deictic expressions, as well as I will somehow try to explain what is the basis of the distinction that Quentin Smith is attempting to make by introducing this distinction. Then I will move on to a certain application of the distinction, or at least, sorry, even two applications of the distinctions. I will attempt to show that taking this distinction seriously might allow us to solve at least two interesting puzzles that are discussed within contemporary philosophy of language, namely the so-called answering machine puzzle and the problem of the so-called non-standard uses of the first person pronoun. Okay, so I will show that in a sense that my aim will be to show that this distinction is fruitful and it might be very helpful to analyze certain interesting phenomena. And I will close the talk with the discussion of something I call here Cohen-Michelson objection, and I will show that the view and the solution to the puzzles mentioned in the points 3 and 4 is immune to this objection, and this, I think, is a nice argument in its favor that maybe indicates its superiority with respect to some other views that might at least prima facie look as interesting. Okay, so let me begin. So that's the plan. Okay, so here during this talk, I shall be using the term deictic expression as a synonym of indexical expression, as the term is used in the literature. As people who work in indexicality might know that historically speaking, various terms were used to somehow single out the class of those expressions. So we had egocentric particulars due to Russell, or token reflexive expressions due to Reichenbach, and some other terminologies were also proposed during the long history of analytic philosophy. But I'm going to use this term deictic expressions as it is well established in linguistics mostly, and also due to the fact that the term indexical expression might be terminologically a bit confusing here, because one of the points I will be discussing here will be the distinction between indexicals and demonstratives. So I will be referring by the term deictic expressions both to indexicals and demonstratives. So I'd like to rather avoid using indexical as an umbrella term for both classes. So this is just a kind of terminological decision which I would like to explain at the very beginning. So you don't have this on the presentation, but without going into any details, deictic expressions, in the sense I will be using that word are the expressions such as I, you, here, now, she, that, etc. Okay, so those are the examples of such expressions. And the general feature, of course, these general features might be analyzed in various complicated manners of those expressions, is that they are somehow systematically connected with certain features of the circumstances in which they are used. So for instance, to use the popular example, when I'm using the first person pronoun I, there is a feature of the context, namely the agent of the context, or maybe the speaker of the context, that somehow influences the reference of that pronoun when used on a particular occasion. So when I'm using I, it refers to me. If any one of you is using I, it refers to you, and this reference is secured by the fact that you are the speaker, you are playing the role of a person in a particular context. So those are the expressions I will be interested in. Of course, there is a big discussion in the literature where to put the boundary between context-sensitive and context-insensitive expressions, and I won't be going into that debate at all. I will be here interested in the narrowly conceived indexicals and demonstratives. So when we are talking about such expressions, and there is a big literature regarding the semantics, pragmatics of such expressions, obviously, we can from time to time meet some taxonomies of those expressions. So some classifications or typologies of those expressions that are proposed by various authors. So I would like to present you some of those typologies. There are others in the literature, but those are the ones that I think which are on the one hand quite popular, and on the other hand, I think they provide a kind of good point departure for some points I want to make in this presentation. So I will say something about the Kaplan's taxonomy of deictic expressions, John Perry's taxonomy of deictic expressions, and just to briefly mention, I won't be talking about this, but there is also a kind of a rather standard taxonomy of deictic expressions that can be found in linguistic literature that distinguishes mostly between personal, temporal, spatial, and discourse deictic uses of deictic expressions. Okay, so this last point I won't be discussing here. We're mostly interested in the Kaplan's and Perry's taxonomy. So let me start with the taxonomy that is probably well known to most of you. But just to discuss it briefly, so Kaplan in Demonstratives divided deictic expressions, or as he used indexical expressions, into two classes: the class of pure indexicals or proper indexicals, as some people say, and the class of demonstratives. So you can find some examples of the expressions in both cases. So pure indexicals are expressions like I, here, now, today, and yesterday, while in the case of demonstratives, we have expressions like this, that, potentially this F, when where F is any predicate. So this dog, this man, etc. So those are the examples of demonstratives. And what is the rationale behind this distinction? According to Kaplan, Kaplan actually changed his view about the reasons or for which we have to somehow make a distinction here. But basically, the intuition is that in the case of pure indexicals, we have a certain feature of the context that, without any intervention of either demonstration or some sort of referential intention, secures the reference of the term on particular context. Okay, so that's the basic for distinguishing pure indexicals. On the other hand, demonstratives, according to Kaplan, at least two Kaplans, because Kaplan, as I told you, changed his view here, are either dependent on the presence of a demonstration, that's a kind of an early Kaplanian view, or they are somehow dependent on the presence of a certain intention to refer to a particular object. So when I'm using this, saying this is beautiful, then usually my utterance is accompanied by a kind of pointing with a finger, for instance, and some intention that also accompanies the use of this on this particular occasion. So the point here is that the distinction between those two classes of expressions might be based basically on those grounds I've just mentioned. And of course, here I use the triangles to indicate that we can start with the Kaplanian distinction, and then we might add something to it, right? So we might basically, for instance, go take this distinction and then apply the standard linguistic taxonomy, and here attempt to generate certain subclasses within that class. I'm not doing this because that's not my point, but I think that it's good to think of the Kaplan's taxonomy here as a kind of invitation to build probably more complicated and more complex taxonomies of indexical or deictic expressions. So this taxonomy is, I think, the most popular in the philosophical literature, and probably most philosophers who write something about indexicals and demonstratives somehow appeal to this Kaplanian taxonomy. But there are others taxonomies that can be found in the literature, at least several ones. But the one which I think was pretty nice and pretty interesting is the one that was proposed by John Perry in several places. So the one I'm discussing here is taken from his reference to the reflexivity book, second edition actually of that work, published in 2012. So Perry goes in a bit different direction, because he thinks that there are two dimensions along which we might classify indexical or deictic expressions. So on the one hand, he thinks that some expressions are, as he says, automatic, and some are discretionary. And what does he mean by that? Because here you have, of course, the examples of those expressions, examples that fit the Perry classification according to Perry. So the idea here behind this distinction is actually not very distant from the idea behind the second Kaplan, actually. The Kaplan in the second interpretation, a Kaplan that appealed to the referential intentions as a basic for making the distinction. Because Perry thinks that in the case of automatic indexical expressions, we have to somehow acknowledge the fact that some features of the context, okay, somehow automatically secure the reference of an expression as it occurs on a particular occasion. So the usual examples are here such that, for instance, I might believe falsely that I am, let's say, Napoleon, but nevertheless, when I'm using I, my belief is irrelevant because only the fact that I am the speaker of the context is relevant for the reference of I in those cases. So this is why those expressions are called automatic. Of course, I'm giving here I'm here giving you only a very general the characteristics of the distinction because it's really a bit more, the case is really a bit more complicated. But here is the basic intuitions. Automatic indexicals are somehow independent of the attitudes of the speakers that are using. On the other hand, this class of discretionary or sometimes intentional, as they are called, deictic expressions, they somehow involve a sort of dependence on some sort of intention that is accompanying the use of a demonstrative. It is not every type of, it is not every arbitrary type of intention, according to Perry. This is a kind of a specific discriminating intention. He's using this term, taking that term from Kaplan. I will go back to that at some point. So here, somehow the idea is that when I'm using these and I'm trying to refer to some kind of object, there must be an intention, referential intention of some particular sort, and this intention is relevant for the determination of the reference. Okay, but this is not the entire story that is offered by Perry, because in addition to that, he's having a nice distinction between narrow and wide kinds of indexical deictic expressions, and this distinction is based on absolutely different grounds, because he thinks that in the case of the narrowly conceived indexical deictic expressions, we have to somehow appeal only to some basic features of the utterance in determining the reference, and those features are the time of utterance, the place of utterance, and the speaker. Those are the three features. If those features play a role in the determination of the reference, Perry says that we are dealing with the narrowly used deictic expression. While in the case of the wide kind of indexical deictic expressions, we somehow extend the class of the properties with respect to which we to which we somehow appeal when determining the reference. And the examples of those expressions are used here. As you can see, there are some interesting features of those of this taxonomy, because, for instance, now and here it appears on both in both places, and this is because Perry thinks, and I think I probably wouldn't agree with him here, and something about this in a minute. He thinks that we somehow cannot univocally treat now and here as narrowly conceived indexical expressions, because on many occasions the reference of now or here might actually refer to a broader area than just the moment of speaking or just the place at which we are. Okay, so there is a kind of intentional control that is involved in the determination of at least the scope of the referent in case of those indexicals. So this is why those expressions end up here in the class of discretionary expressions, but still Perry thinks that due to the fact that they are somehow involving the time as a feature of the utterance, they are somehow narrow in that sense. On the other hand, in the case of the widely conceived indexical expressions, Perry is using the examples of yeah, which is one of my favorite expressions in the talks I gave in recent years. So this is the kind of an indexical, according to Perry, because actually I think it's the demonstrative rather. It's an expression that refers to the distance between the hands of the speaker who is making a gesture. Okay, so I can say this fish is big, and I refer to a distance that is the length of the fish on a particular occasion. Okay, So this is a kind of taxonomy that's a bit more sophisticated than the Kaplanian one. Of course, it's not totally unrelated to the previous one, because we somehow see that in this automatic discretionary distinction, we somehow mapped this pure distinction between pure indexicals and demonstratives. At least we want to capture the distinction somehow, because here we are talking about intentions, and here we are just talking about the narrowly conceived features of contexts. So actually, this is a kind of the nice and sophisticated view. But maybe just one comment. I think that there are reasons to think that this view at the end of this taxonomy at the end of the day might really get rid of the two branches over here. Namely, we might really think of in terms of demonstratives and move it into that part. Why I think it is also a kind of a mistake to think that the fact that we might, by using now or here, refer to various various kinds of time frames or space frames, it is not, I think, the reason to put those terms in the class of discretionary indexicals. But this is another issue. I might discuss that in the discussion. But I think if we'll rather erase those 2 points, then it's quite nice. We arrive at a quite nice result, because we have a kind, at least extensionally, nicer distinction between automatic and discretionary, which we might really extensionally replace with the distinction between narrow and wide indexicals. So those are just examples of the taxonomies two examples of the taxonomies that can be found in the literature. And I think they are based on a quite important philosophical insights, and there are strong intuitions between those taxonomies. So I'm not going to criticize the taxonomies here, but I would rather challenge something that is a kind of the assumption behind those making such taxonomies and maybe other taxonomies in the literature. So the point here is that if you will take a look at the taxonomies, like the two I've just mentioned, they are not using at any point the notion of an use of an expression. So they are really taxonomies of expressions. So we have the class, it's assumed that we have a class of deictic expressions, and the class can be divided into such and such subclasses. That's a general idea. Why I think that it might be quite interesting to look at those kinds of taxonomies in a bit different manner, namely by attempting to replace them with the taxonomies that will be rather taxonomies not of expressions, but taxonomies of uses of expressions, okay? And this is a kind of the main thesis that I will trying to elaborate in the talk, and I will trying to somehow convince you to believe in. Okay, so that's the kind of general observations about the taxonomies. And if we will take out the literature here, not only just on Kaplanian taxonomy, on Paris taxonomy, then, for instance, there are very interesting pieces of very interesting works in linguistics that introduce at some point the notion of a use of an expression, but usually this notion is introduced after we arrive at a certain taxonomy of expressions. And after we have it, then we apply the distinction between various kinds of uses of that expression at the end of the day. So here is just one example, which I really like. It's an example of not the taxonomy of the entire class of deictic expressions. It is the taxonomy of the uses of demonstratives. So we have just demonstratives, okay? So we just have this class, if we follow Kaplanian distinction, and then within this class, we might make the following taxonomy, and here the notion of the use is introduced by Holger Diesel in his book about demonstratives. So according to this distinction, we might say that the uses of demonstratives are either exophoric, as he uses the term, endophoric, and in that class of the endophoric, we have anaphoric, discourse deictic, and recognitional uses, okay? And just to give you the idea what is behind those terms, in the case of exophoric uses, those are the most standard uses, the uses that require the reference to a certain features of the conversational situations, such as pointing gesture and other ways of manners that are employed when we are identifying an object when using, for instance, the expression "this" on a particular occasion. On the other hand, in the case of endophoric uses, we have anaphoric uses. I think this notion doesn't require any explanation, but in addition to that, we have discourse deictic uses, the cases in which we are referring, as Diesel says, to either proposition that has been expressed by some previous piece of text or to a illocutionary aspect of the proposition. Okay, so the example is if someone says 2 and 3 gives 6, then some B reacts, that's false, and by using that's is really referring to a proposition expressed by that, and those cases are called cases of discourse deictics. On the other hand, we also have the recognitional uses, which are, this is a very interesting case because those are uses, as illustrated by this example. So I'm saying I couldn't sleep last night, that dog next door kept me awake. So we have that dog as a demonstrative expressions about which we are talking here. And the phenomenon here is that we somehow refer to a particular dog without, of course, making any pointing gesture, well, when using demonstrative, but we are somehow making use here of some sort of background knowledge that is a part of the conversation. And so linguists at least say that cases of such uses are discourse new. So they say that this use, that dog introduces some entity into the universe of discourse, while at the very same time they want to say that they are here old, and by this they mean that the referent is somehow present in some set of the presuppositions that are accompanying the use of that expression in the context. So this is a quite nice distinction, but the point which I want to make is, of course, not to comment on various features of that distinction, but rather to point out at the fact that the idea of a use is introduced only after we somehow single out the class of demonstratives, and then we start to talk about various kinds of uses. And somehow I would like to suggest that maybe it might be more useful to attempt to replace the taxonomies of those sorts with taxonomies of uses of expressions rather than just introduce those distinctions between uses at some level of analysis later. So I think that there is an interesting alternative to this taxonomical trend in the theory of indexicals and demonstratives. And this trend has been actually observed by some authors. And I think the author that made this point extremely clear, and this is why I call it Smith's thesis, because I think that Smith is very clear about that point, is the suggestion that maybe instead of dividing indexicals into demonstratives and pure indexicals, we should rather divide uses of indexicals, so uses of deictic terms in my terminology, into demonstrative uses and pure indexical uses. Okay, so this is something as I call here the Smith's thesis. And I think that one direct consequence of such approach is that we might ask some questions that are potentially very interesting. Namely, one question, and this will be the question I will be interested in here mostly, is the question whether expressions that are traditionally classified as purely indexicals, whether they can have demonstrative uses. That's the question which we might ask when we are applying or following the Smith's path. We might also ask the opposite question, namely, if expressions that are traditionally classified as demonstratives have purely indexical uses. So this is a kind of a reverse question with respect to the previous one. I'm just mentioning that question because that's a kind of a question one might ask when following this Smith's suggestion. I will not go into that direction here. I will be mostly interested in that question. So assuming the correctness of Smith's observation or Smith's idea to go into a certain taxonomical direction. One may obviously ask, and this is a very interesting philosophical question, what is the ground for making a distinction between purely indexical uses of deictic expressions and demonstrative uses of deictic expressions? So that's a general question we want to have answered. So, of course, this is a big topic, and it's discussed in the literature, not necessarily in terms of uses, but in terms of expressions. But it is quite important, I think, to note that not all analyses which can be found in the literature might be applied in an interesting manner to this distinction. So, for instance, one might think that that we might use Paris ideas to somehow provide the boundary between the two classes of uses. So, especially this distinction between automatic and discretionary use, and the notion of the discriminating intention, that is the kind of a factor that plays a role in the determination of the demonstrative use. So here is the quote from Perry, who says something like that: "It is not just any referential intention that is relevant to demonstratives, but only the most basic ones, which I will call directing intention." Following couple. We take directing intention to be the intention to refer to an object X in virtue of the meaning of one's word and the context, both pre-existing and supplied by the speaker. This sense of directing intentions applies to all indexicals. So here, if someone is going in the direction of saying the certain intention is present in the case of demonstratives and not present in the case of pure indexicals, and when he reads this part, right, he might be disappointed, because that's not the difference, right? The presence of the intention is not something that grounds the difference. But Perry says something like that: it is not the presence of the intention, but the issue whether this intention is effective, referentially effective or not. Okay, so one might think about the cases that, let's say, the distinction between these and the distinction between I, to use the very simple, example, is that in the case of I, the intention is ineffective. It might somehow correspond to what context does, okay, but it is ineffective that alone it cannot do the job, the referential job, while in the case of this, it is, or it might be at least, referentially effective. Okay, so that's the idea that one might think that grounds the distinction between demonstrative uses and purely indexical uses. But this is not the case, I think. So this, we cannot really apply this distinction here, because there are some examples that show that we might deal, for instance, with expressions that are definitely used indexically, and in the case of which an intention, which is a directing intention in the sense of Perry, plays a role that is referentially essential or determinative. And my examples which I'm using are usually examples of so-called distributed utterances. So we might say today is Monday and today is Tuesday, and assuming, for instance, that we are speaking slowly enough to pass during speaking from Monday to Tuesday. Okay, there might be a question to which day today refers on both occasions. Okay, and it seems that, at least this is the intuition shared by some, including me, for instance, that the intention here plays a role. Okay, it plays a role in choosing at least which day we refer to. So if we agree with those kinds of examples, then we might somehow be a bit skeptical whether this kind of grounding the distinction in terms of intentions might be of some help. Of course, this is not the criticism of intentionality, because I think the intentional component is extremely important in making that distinction, but it probably should be explained or described in at least a bit different manner. So going back to that question, we might maybe consider some other options. So one set of possibilities looks as follows: a kind of a simple set of criteria, and they are not disconnected. So the criteria here are connected. So you might say somehow that in the case of demonstrative uses, we first might note that we always have a broadly conceived demonstration that is present, okay? That's the first point. The second point, which is related to the previous one, is that we might deal here with the cases of incomplete uses. And the third point is that in the case of demonstrative uses, we have the possibility of vague use but complete uses of those expressions. So let me explain the 3 points, okay? So the first point probably is obvious, so I would just mention that. So we at least can observe, and probably everybody will agree, I will go back to that later, that standard demonstrative uses are accompanied by demonstration. Okay, so this is a kind of obvious point. Somebody might raise a hand and say, but those, look, obviously there are cases of demonstrative uses which are not accompanied by a demonstration, but I will note that point in a second. Okay, so I'm just now explaining what those criteria might be connected with. So the other point is the point of the possibility of incomplete uses, and this point is based on the observation made, among others, by Kaplan, that it is clear that one can distinguish a demonstrative with a vague use demonstration, no referent, from a demonstrative with no associated demonstrations, incomplete. So the possibility of the incomplete demonstration, demonstrative use, is a kind of the case in which we are using something demonstratively, but at the very same time, we are not performing the appropriate demonstration, and by the same, as a result of that, we are ending up with the vacuous, but vacuous due to incompleteness demonstrative. Okay, so that's the second criterion. The third criterion is the possibility of vague use but complete uses. So this is connected with the observations that the reference of typical purely indexical uses is secured on each occasion. There are authors, and that's a quite influential tradition, that defend that this is the case for the indexicals. So in other words, if someone utters I, it's somehow secured in reference when it is indexically, purely indexically used. And even in the tradition of thinking of indexicals in terms of hybrid names, some people think that there is a close analogy between indexicals such as I or now and the use of quotation marks. So namely, if you use quotation marks and if we put somehow inside quotation marks, the very fact that we use the quotation marks secures the reference of the entire expression that is the quotation. And they say that there is an analogy between the quotation cases and the purely indexical cases. So of course, the two other criteria, this of incompleteness and being vague, are simply the consequence of the fact that we are somehow or they are connected with the fact that we somehow want the demonstrative uses to be accompanied by a demonstration. So, armed with those distinctions, which I will criticize soon, we might ask the question about particular indexicals, whether they have demonstrative uses, okay? Because that was the point we started, okay? So to just remind you, our point was that we started with this Smith's distinction, and then we said that, well, one consequence of this is that we can raise some interesting questions, okay? And one question was whether indexical uses, something that is called indexical, traditional indexical expressions, whether they can have demonstrative uses. So that was the interesting question. So we are going back to that question. So, let's consider the case of here. That's an easy case somehow because it has been noted in the literature by some people. So obviously, here has demonstrative uses, okay? And just to quote Kaplan, who follows suggestion of Bennett, Kaplan observes, and that his famous example, that we might say, in 2 weeks, I will be here, and point to a city on a map, okay? And he says, at his comments, that here, over there, is used demonstratively, okay? It is not an indexical here as traditionally used, but this is a demonstrative, okay? And if you will think about this Kaplanian example and the 3 criteria I've just mentioned, so they are met in this case, okay? So first of all, the demonstration is present, okay? That's obvious. We might consider here the case of incomplete use because somebody might not perform the demonstration. So the person in question might not point to a city on a map. And of course, it might be vague use because, for instance, there are several scenarios that one might invent. One might hallucinate the map. One might have on the map the non-existent place, okay? For instance, an island or something like that, okay? So those are the cases that secure the fact that the three criteria are met for this example. So I think it's pretty well grounded that here, demonstrated here, have demonstrated use. But now there are other interesting questions. For instance, the question is, does now have demonstrative uses? And here is, of course, that's a more tricky case, a bit more. But I would say that there are examples that show that definitely it can have demonstrative uses. So I will give you two examples. So I'm giving you two because I think that at least one of them might not be so obvious. So I'm using the second one just to give you an alternative here. So first example goes as follows. So suppose that you're watching a seismograph and you want to point out the moments when a particular seismic event occurs, okay? At certain moments, you say now and point to a place on the graph, okay? It might happen. That's the thing that people communicate like that, exactly and precisely. And of course, if we will think about this case, then we, on the one hand, have the presence of some demonstration. We, at the very same time, might have the possibility of incomplete use because one might fail to perform an indication when saying now. And of course, there is a possibility of vague use, but complete use because the seismograph might be malfunctioning, okay, not showing an event we want to identify, okay? So this is the example of a demonstrative use of now that meets the three criteria I've just mentioned. But if you're not happy with that, here is another example, I think, which is more convincing, maybe even. So this is an example of the so-called historical present that is discussed in the literature about the indexicals and demonstratives. So the example is that I falsely believe that Napoleon died in 1850. That's the supposition of the story. And I utter intending to speak about some moment in 1832. So that was the year that Napoleon's son died. Napoleon reads the letter from France. He is now in despair over the death of his son. Of course, the use of now is relevant for the example here. And the point here with this example is that we are trying here to identify a particular moment of 1832 by reference to some event that never took place, okay? Because Napoleon was dead, so there was no act of reading a letter in 1850, okay? So here we have the example that I think nicely illustrates a point of the possibility of, for instance, vague use of a demonstrative, okay? So if you don't like this example, okay, I think this one shows quite nicely that we are dealing here with demonstrative uses. You might, of course, ask, where is the demonstration here? And I would say that the linguistic description that is provided over there plays a role of a demonstration, of course, by broadly conceived. Okay, so this is the analysis which I would provide. And finally, we might ask whether the first person pronoun have demonstrative uses. And the answer to the question is, of course, yes. And it's quite easy answer because those cases were identified in the literature. So just to quote the example from the paper of Koratsa, Fish and Gorvet. So we might consider the case, Joe is not in his office one day and Ben notices that the number of students keep approaching his door and knocking, right? They then stand around and look bemused for a while before leaving, taking pity on these poor souls, wasting their time. Ben decides to attach to his I'm not here today note to Joe's door. Okay, so here this is an interesting example because according to some authors, at least I hear, refers to Joe, so it refers not to the speaker, not to the even to the producer, not to the producer of the token, not to the user of the token, it refers to John that is not at all involved in the production of the token. Okay, and I think this is a quite beautiful example of the demonstrative use of I. This is because, among other things, probably the three features I've mentioned are met here. So there is a broadly conceived demonstration that is present. This is the act of attaching the node to the door. There is a possibility of incomplete use because the node might be produced by never attached to Joe's or anyone's door, actually. And of course, there is also the possibility of vacuous but complete use, because I might falsely believe that the office is used by someone and attach that to the door, and I will fail to refer in those cases. Okay, so here we have the examples of the, I think, of the demonstrative uses of IaaS. So, the answer to our question is definitely positive. Some expressions that are traditionally classified as indexicals or pure indexicals have demonstrative uses. Okay, and I think this is kind of a well-established point. So I am not entirely convinced by the three criteria I just mentioned, because they are problematic when we think about other cases. Because, for instance, we might consider cases in which of clearly demonstrative uses, in which, of course, there is no explicit demonstrations, and those cases are, of course, discussed in the literature. So some objects might be salient in the context, and we don't have to perform a demonstration in such a case. And of course, this case of recognitional uses in the DISL classification is also, this class is also the cases that is full of such examples, actually. And of course, we might sometimes even consider cases in demonstrative uses cannot fail to refer. For instance, when I'm uttering, that's the example I like, taken from Levinson, Harvey can speak only this loud, and this imitates the sound, the loudness of the Harvey's manner of speaking. Of course, here we have the reference secured, the reference to the abstract object secured somehow. So there are some counterexamples to this, to the general application of the criteria in question. And of course, we might somehow try to find an alternative here. And I think that we have to go intentional here at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, instead of applying those criteria, we have to somehow go back to the fact that there is a kind of special type of intention that is somehow behind the demonstrative uses that is not present or plays a different role than in the case of indexical uses. So despite the fact that I somehow oppose the Perry's distinction, I think that Perry has a point. I think it's really important to somehow mention the notion of intention here at some point. So one way of describing this is to say that what makes an use of an expression a demonstrative use is the intention to refer to as something by means of some identifying procedure, okay? And the notion of identifying procedures is broader than the notion of demonstration. So all demonstrations are identifying procedures, but this class of identifying procedures might be richer than the class of demonstrations, of which the speaker thinks that its execution will secure the reference of an expression on a particular occasion. And of course, the execution might be bad, and the procedure might be never executed, so it might, on some occasion, result in some incorrect semantical characteristic of the demonstrative on a particular occasion, the reference failure, for instance. So, and of course, I think that generally the demonstrative use of here, now, and I, as use the examples, they share this feature with standard demonstrative uses of this, for instance, because I think it goes without saying that they involve the intention to refer to a particular object by means of some identifying procedure of which the speaker thinks that its execution will secure the reference, okay? And of course, I can say that mostly because among such procedures, I might have the procedure that can be described by saying that do not spoil that, what you already have, okay? So in case of the objects that are somehow salient in the context, okay, it might somehow happen that not doing anything, okay, and somehow assuming that something that is already attracting the attention of the participant is the referent might be a kind of procedure that we might apply here. So we might somehow act by not acting, so to speak. But of course, this is not a kind of surprising for people who think about the philosophy of actions, because the case of intentional refrainings or omissions are widely discussed in the philosophy of action. So it shouldn't be surprised that we might go in that direction. The other way to go, which is also an alternative, is go back to this Perry classification or taxonomy I've mentioned here, but this one that says that somehow says that there is nothing in the classes of wide, automatic, and discretionary narrow deictic terms. And if we assume this kind of distinction, then what we might do, and that's a kind of a nice trick we might do here, is that despite referring simply to automatic discretionary distinction, we might replace the distinction with the narrow wide distinction in this case, okay? Because it's extensionally at least the same in those cases. So we might here say that those are the specific features of utterance that somehow are responsible for the fact that we are dealing with the demonstrative uses, while on the other hand, some other features of the utterance that are not, of course, relevant here might be responsible for the fact that we are dealing with demonstrative uses of expressions. And I think this is a nice way to go. I won't be defending that here, but I think this is a kind of hypothesis that at least deserves further attention. Okay, so this is what I wanted to say about the Smith's thesis, and somehow the something that grounds the distinction between demonstrative uses and purely indexical uses or pure indexical uses.
I should point out, Todd, that if sundry apologies, if I may, I should point out, you did say I should point out when 35 minutes will have passed, and they have passed indeed, and I just thought I'd flag that. Thanks.
Okay, so I will just speed up. Maybe I'll omit some points in order to not take too much time, but I would like to, at least I'd like to discuss some applications. Okay, so that's important. So I think if we'll somehow agree with Smith's observation, then we have some fruitful applications of the idea. So the first application applies to the so-called famous or infamous answering machine puzzle. Okay, so the puzzle was, I think, it was noted by many authors, but I think that's Kaplan notes that in demonstratives and the footnote, but I think that Gerald Vision was the person who, for the first time, explicitly somehow mentioned those kinds of cases, discussed them. So the problem is that it seems that we have a true utterances of expressions like the ones you have in points 1, 2, and 3. So I'm not here now, I'm now dead, or it is now Monday, but I do not believe that it is now Monday. And of course, we might consider scenarios, for instance, that the messages here were recorded and played, let's say, at my funeral on Monday. And in those cases, it seems that all the three utterances count as true, which goes against a certain prediction of the Kaplanian analysis of such expressions. And of course, this is a kind of a simple observation, and there is big literature regarding how to analyze the problems. You have some list here. I think that some authors of some ideas regarding the puzzle are present in the audience. So I'm just mentioning that there's a lot of interesting ideas here. But my aim here is not to criticize those solutions, but rather to enrich the logical space of possible accounts of the puzzling phenomenon by adding additional solution, okay, which I think might be considered superior with respect to many of them in terms of simplicity and elegance potential. So the idea will be, of course, to say that now the expression now in one phrase used demonstratively, exactly in the way in which it's used in other cases I tried to point out. Because if we'll think in that way, then we definitely secure the possibility of now as used, not referring to the moment at which the utterance is produced or even played, okay? And I think that's quite obvious point. And additionally, and I think if we'll think about those cases, another thing that might somehow point out into the direction of analyzing those cases as cases of demonstrative uses is the point that in those cases, the uses of now are somehow under intentional control to some extent. And this is somehow assumed by people like Predelli, who apply the idea of the expected time of the utterance into the analysis. But the point here is that, let's say, if you are recording a kind of message to be played on a certain occasion, and let's say you die and nobody plays that in the next 100 years, but after it's discovered by archaeologists and played on that occasion, I think we cannot say that now refers to the time at which the archaeologists decode that message, because somehow it goes beyond the intentional restrictions you put on the potential time at which the message might be played. So I think that's another consideration that somehow might indicate that we are dealing here with the demonstrative use of now. Moreover, if we agree that the descriptions within the scope of that play a role of Kaplanian describing as a form of pointing, then demonstrative uses in those cases might be even analyzed in terms of that. Namely, we could say that the true form of those expressions looks as follows. I am not here at that, the moment when the message is played. I am dead at that, the moment when the message is played. It is Monday at that, the moment the message is played. But I do not believe that at that, the moment when the message is played, that it is Monday. Okay, so we might even go in that direction, provide this that term analysis of those cases. I don't want to defend that view here, but I think it's an interesting theoretical option to go in that direction. So we have, I think, a pretty nice description and analysis of the cases of the answering machine puzzle, when noticing that now might be used demonstratively in those cases. And the same applies to the cases of non-standard uses of I, like in the example with the office I used when quoting Corazza and others. Okay, so here again, just to remind you what the example was. The example was with this attaching the note to Joe's door and referring to Joe without Joe being involved at all. Then we might also think that this is the case in which we are dealing with non-standard uses of I, which are demonstrative uses, in fact. And what I want to say about this kind of solution approach to those kinds of cases is that in the literature that discusses those kinds of cases, then usually the point of departure is Kaplanian semantics and observation that I refers in that semantics to the agent of the context. And most of the literature here is devoted to the problem how the agent of the context is determined. Okay, and there are various ideas regarding that. So various proposals give various analyses of that question and various answers to that question. So my point actually here is that the solution or account of non-standard uses of I as demonstrative uses does not fly in the face of this theoretical trend at all. So what I'm saying only is that those considerations regarding how the agent of the context is determined on a particular occasion should be applied after we will determine whether the I is used demonstratively or purely indexically. Okay, because we have a demonstrative use of that expression, then the considerations regarding who is the agent of the context and how the agent of the context is determined are not important for those cases at all. Okay, so this is the kind of theory I want to defend here. And interestingly, I think this might be extended to some other cases, not all non-standard cases of uses of I, because the issue here is a bit problematic. But if you consider cases like the example, I'm now in jail by someone playing Monopoly, okay, when the pawn of the person is in jail on the board, then it seems that here I is again used demonstratively because we are using that with the intention to refer to a particular object, namely character in the game, by means of some identifying procedure, which is even a demonstration, by which I mean the placing the pawn on a particular square, okay, of which the speaker thinks that its execution will secure the reference of I. So I think this is also, again, the case of demonstrative use of I. So we might somehow transcend just the cases of the use of I in the contexts mentioned by the office-like scenarios in general. So let me close that with the final thing I want to say, namely that if we will follow this tradition, then one might say, okay, but this analysis might be similar to the so-called ambiguity views that are present in the discussion about the, for instance, the answering machine puzzle. And the ambiguity views were, among others, introduced by Smith in this paper in which he makes this important distinction I started the presentation with. But what is important here is there are large distinctions between the account I'm defending here and the account of Smith, for instance. So first of all, we are not at all committed here to any version of producing tokening ambiguity that is relevant for the Smith's analysis. So we are not having any kind of reference to this kind of distinction. Moreover, the notion of ambiguity as present in the ambiguity view, it becomes rather non-standard when we are starting to speak about the uses of expressions, because we don't have to claim that here, I, or now are ambiguous due to the fact that they have different uses. This is not a kind of inference we might have in those particular cases, okay? And moreover, as I will show, and that will be the last point I want to make, is that the view of the problem indicated by the view I'm defending somehow replies to the problem, certain problem indicated by authors such as Cohen and Michelson. So what is the objection that Cohen and Michelson are giving to cases of the cases of theories, ambiguities, views about here and now? So they say that we cannot defend ambiguity claims because sentences like the two you have here, they don't have true uses, okay? Because one of the tests for ambiguity is that if an expression is ambiguous, then we build a conjunction that contains the P with one term and not P with the other term, and it can have true uses, okay? So this is how we detect potential ambiguities. And they say nothing like this happens in the case of here and now. So they say that there are no true uses of sentences like Magdalena is here, but Magdalena is not here, or Boris is present now, but Boris is not present now. But the point here is that they are wrong when they are saying something like this, because it's not very difficult to find the true readings of such sentences if we employ the demonstrative view use. So, for instance, I might use here, okay, when I point to a distance place on the map, while uttering here with Magdalena sitting in front of me. So I might say Magdalena is here pointing on the, Magdalena is here pointing on a chair in which Magdalena is sitting, but Magdalena is not here somehow pointing at the place at which which is an island on the map, okay, for instance. In the first case, I don't have to use, of course, the demonstration. So, and this is a clear example of a true use of a sentence that keeps the context fixed. That's important. And similar considerations apply to the second example, which is maybe a more tricky, but the entire, I think, intuition that might point out into the direction that we might have problems with finding the true readings of the sentence of the form Boris is present now, but Boris is not present now, is actually connected with the fact that we have the interference here of the adverb now and the present tense that is used in the sentences, okay? Because is here is used in the present tense, and it might be difficult to find such reading if we will forget about the fact. And I think the entire strength of the example, even by Cohen and Michelson, really rests on this kind of ignoring the fact that we are having here the present tense in the sentence. If we will keep in mind that is should be interpreted tenseless in order to be in any way relevant for the determination of potential true uses of such cases, then I think nothing prohibits the true readings of the two nows in the example. For instance, I might, let's say, think of Boris sitting in front of me while I'm watching a video recording without Boris present present in the video recording. And definitely I might use that truly and keep the context fixed while using one of the nows here, demonstrative. So we have a very nice reply to the Cohen-Mitrosian objection. So to sum up, the idea of demonstrative use looks very fruitful as it offers intuitive and simple analysis of some puzzling phenomena involving I and now. At the very same time, it is clearly superior with respect to standard ambiguity views. And I think, moreover, and I was trying to show that the view in terms of uses or taxonomies of dative expressions given or uses, dative uses, in terms of uses that are demonstrated in lexical, they somehow might employ ideas taken from the, let's say, Kaplanian or Paris taxonomies that we can find in the literature. So there is a kind of, there is, I think, no conflict at some point because we might employ several observations into distinctions between uses. And finally, and that's the last thing I want to say, is that the framework, if I am right, and this is of course the beginning of a work here, then the Kaplanian logic of demonstratives and several variants of that logic or modifications of that logic is actually the logic of particular kinds of uses of expression. So this is not the logic of expressions, this is a kind of logic of uses of expressions. So this is a logic of purely indexical uses and demonstrative uses. And I think taking this perspective will, of course, do nothing wrong with Kaplanian logic of demonstratives. Moreover, as I was trying to show, it might help us to explain away certain potential counterexamples to such to this approach to context-sensitive expressions, or as I would prefer to say, uses of context-sensitive expressions. So I think that would be all. And sorry for talking for too long time, but that's I think all the points I wanted to make. Here's a short look at the literature. And of course, your feedback is very welcome. And this is, as I told you, just the beginning of a certain manner of thinking about it, a way of thinking about the issue. So thank you again for your attention. That will be all.
Thank you so much to Professor Ciecierski, and I'm sure that everyone's joining me as I see that many of you are already, and thanking him for a wonderful talk. And let me be the first to thank so much to Professor Hasok Chang for being with us. I see that many of you have questions that you've already liked to raise. I know that there's been an abundant conversation going on in chat. And so naturally, I'd like to invite you all to raise your questions, either via raising your virtual hand, or if you'd like to perhaps raise the points you've made in chat viva voce. If you would, I see there are some points made by Dr. Marcin Zawadzki and by Mr. Katalin Teohage. But there might be some other points as well. Marcin, please go ahead.
Okay, simple, Martin, because I don't have any title. I'm just a friend of Mr. Tadeusz Ciecierski, invited for the speech. I just pointed that in the descriptive use of now, that, for example, if I look at the film with a friend, that film I know, I could, for example, said that the look will destroy Death Star right now, referring to now as a part in film, or even more that if I look at the historical film, I could said that my city was destroyed now, referring not that now at the point of time, but the point of film, and even the point of film that is referring to the point in the history.
Yes, yes, obviously, that's a very good example, I think, of the use of now to refer not to the moment of utterance. Yes, that's a great example, I would say. So thank you. I will even note that because that might be a very helpful one. So yeah, so I can say only that those are very good examples. So thanks for providing them to me. but I think that will enrich the material I'm using for the for making certain points in the talk.
All right, thanks so much to Dr. Zawadzki, and sundry apologies if I'm misspelling your name in any way. Next up, I believe we had Mr. Cătălin Teohaghie. Cătălin is a master's student in the Mind the Brain program at the University of Bucharest. Cătălin, please go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to also point to one example. Let's say that today we are at this conference and then we ask a question, should we discuss a specific topic at this conference or maybe at the next one? And you can answer, now let us do it now, which means, of course, there is this 2 hours interval. And we can play with these examples to specify this hour, this minute, this second, even this century, right? Is this on that part of the history or this part of the history, or is this in present time? Well, it's now, actually. This is something that happens now in the 21st century, it's supposedly.
Yes, you're absolutely right. This observation has been made by several authors during the long history of discussion about this topic. Sometimes I'm quoting Churchill, who said some point that now the aircraft is a kind of a real battle force in wars, something like that. So it's of course now refers not to the moment of speaking, it refers to some much more larger period of time. So such uses are common. I would say they are present everywhere. But of course, an interesting question is how to describe semantically this fact that such uses are possible and how they exactly look like. And I wasn't talking about this in that talk, exactly how to approach the analysis of those cases, but I think this is a kind of common mistake in the literature that states that the semantic rule for now and today, because the same can be applied to today, the same can be applied to yesterday and to similar, that they strictly must refer to a particular strictly defined moments of time, like the day, or the moment of speaking or something else. I think that this is a mistake. I think that the correct semantic view is rather, we should say that they refer to a certain period of times that are somehow related to the moment of utterance. For instance, in the case of let's say today, used for some to refer to some longer period of time. I think the rule is that rather this period should contain the moment of speaking as a part, okay? But its length is not somehow restricted from above, so to speak, somehow. So I would say that that would be a proper semantic way to go in the analysis of such expressions. But some people think that this is not the way to go, so because they think that some intentional component must be relevant here. But I wouldn't say that this is more connected with the rules of language than with simply the intentions. They simply allow such uses, and that's the point. So yeah, so thank you for the question. But of course, another interesting question arises immediately, right? How to approach such cases? Yes.
And I have another question, but I see there is a hand raised, so I'll wait my turn.
All right, thanks so much, Cătălin and Tadek, for answering. Our next question is from Dr. Dan Zeman. Congratulations, Dan, both on your current position in Warsaw and on your future position in San Rafael. Please go ahead.
Thanks. There's not much to congratulate on, to be honest. I was happy to let Teohaghie if you want to go ahead. But anyway, can I have a quick follow-up on that discussion? So Tadeusz, why would you take, so first of all, thanks for the talk, really interesting. Why wouldn't you take those uses to be demonstrative as well? Like the kind of like extended uses in a way.
Of now.
Yeah, I mean, you're already going that direction, right? So you kind of.
I would say I would say that they are not demonstrative.
Okay, and
I
why
would
exactly?
say that they are indexical uses. This is what I would like to say about such uses. So
okay, good. Well, I mean, that's okay. So can I ask the question now? Okay, so I have a bunch of questions, but let me go with this. So towards the end, you talked about ambiguity. I think it's more like a general big picture question, and maybe that's useful for you when writing the paper and stuff like that. I mean, you said that your view doesn't appeal to ambiguity, and I really like that. I actually hate ambiguity views for many things, and so that's cool. But so there's still the question, as you said. You answer a question, but then there is immediately another question popping up. And the question that I want to ask is like, okay, well, I mean, I like the big idea that you're not starting with like expressions and type of expressions, but you're starting with uses and types of uses. Let's call them like that. But I guess the question that arises, and that's connected to ambiguity, right? The question that arises is like, okay, what's your semantic treatment for these expressions that allow that kind of uses, right? So, and then you can see whether the view you propose is ambiguous or not. And I have two examples in mind to illustrate what I mean. So, in this literature that I'm familiar with, and I guess you to a certain extent, when it comes to predicates of taste, right? People talk of different types of uses, exocentric versus egocentric, but nobody would say like, oh, okay, these are different types of users, we have to give different semantics, right? It's the same semantics, it's just, some value of certain parameter is different, right? That's what happens. On the other hand, you have, what's a bit more traditionally, the referential uses of definite descriptions and the attributive uses, right? These are also called uses, but that leads some people to postulate completely different semantics for these two types of uses, right? So I guess before judging whether your view is an ambiguity view or not, you have to tell me what exactly your view is on these things. And moreover, you have to tell me how your view allows for this type of uses, right? Does it make sense? Like what exactly is the view and how does it accommodate the uses? And then I will know whether it's an ambiguity view or not. Does it make sense?
So that's a great question. I mean, that's a very difficult question.
But you're used to that.
Yeah, obviously, yes, and that's
from me.
Yeah, but of course, I will try to sketch some reply now. But let me explicitly say that this is a kind of issue I'm thinking about, and so I have certain theoretical intuitions regarding those kinds of considerations, but I'm not totally certain that they are on the right track. So let me just say that what I think there are at least two things which I think about such a case. So the first is that I think that the one thing that we have to somehow be very sensitive to when we talk about those cases is, of course, distinction between meaning of an expression and the content of an expression. And so just to, of course, this is not the perfect illustration, but the distinction, of course, in Kaplanian semantics is reflected by the distinction between character and content, okay? So character is like meaning of an expression, content is content, right? So that's a truth conditional aspect of that expression. So I think that the ambiguity view should somehow be connected with saying that at the level of meaning, okay, we have various kinds of rules that connect contexts or aspect of context with content, okay? So if we will have this, so if we will say that the use U1 is such that in the cases of analogous occurrences of expressions, we have a certain kind of dependence of the content on some feature of the context, then we say, well, that's definitely something that has an effect for the meaning of the expression that is used. And we might say that this is ambiguity view. So of course, given that the use U2 also generates a different dependence between the two factors. So I would say that this is the general way I would like to go. But I'm not. But I'm not considering it as the only way to approach the problem, because the second way might be a more general. We might somehow risk saying that at the level of meaning, the meaning of expression of an expression is a kind of a set of some very general rules that are governing what uses are not prohibited as uses of an expression. Okay, so here the view is that we have an expression, we have a kind of a meaning of that expression, and this meaning allows certain uses and disallows certain other uses. Okay, from that point of view, the relevant question would be whether we want to analyze those cases as the cases with a single meaning and uses that are allowed by this meaning, not prohibited by this meaning, or the cases in which we are rather have general meaning and case that somehow contradicts this meaning or is in conflict with this meaning or is prohibited rather by this meaning. And then in virtue of the fact we have to say that we have to introduce another meaning of that expression. So I think this is the other way to go. And so those are two directions in which the analysis might be somehow directed. But the question to you is: do you think that there is a kind of important difference between the two approaches and kind of the fruitfulness of the going in one way or another in general? For instance, in the debates regarding the predicates of the of personal taste. So do you think that people who you described that somehow want to keep the meaning untouched, by at the very same time they want to provide some two kinds of semantic analysis in conditional terms, they would be happy with choosing, let's say, the first way or the second way, or maybe they are somehow they would end up somehow completely neutral with respect to that?
Can I give a quick answer, Andrei?
Sure. Yeah, that's
yes,
the question to them. So I'm very curious about what.
Yes, I mean, not in that debate. I don't think that ambiguity plays much of a role there. And actually, you know, the two ways you describe, I think like the second, that seems fine. The first, I don't think that's correct, because I think so ambiguity, even in the Kaplanian framework, would be basically difference in character, right? That will be proper ambiguity. Because otherwise you will end up conflating ambiguity with simply context sensitivity, right? Not to mention also there's polysemy, which is you know, that complicates matters even more. You know, there's this discussion: what's the difference between polysemy and ambiguity? You know, there's some tests. I don't know, they're not very reliable. But the idea is that, you know, with the polysemy, that somewhere in between the two, as it were, you have a stable meaning, but it's a, you know, complex meaning. Depends also what you have, but most people think it's complex meaning, and then like specific meaning get selected in a certain context, right? So you have the context imposes some interpretation or something like that. So yeah, with that second idea, I would be happy with that. The ambiguity in the literature of predicate of taste, that has been a view, but it's basically it's a minority view, and it's basically between objective senses and subjective senses. That's not really what you want, I think. Okay. And I just stop. We can talk about that.
Yeah, but just a brief comment. So I don't want to go into details here, but since I'm quite friendly towards the idea of directive theory of meaning, the one that Pavel, for instance, Grabarczyk works on. And in that theory of meaning, we exactly have the second way of approaching the meaning of expression. So we have the kind of prohibitory semantics, okay? So we have some uses that are allowed by meaning and some that are disallowed by meaning. And this is a kind of very general idea. And I'd love to, I don't have it at the present, I'd love to have the general semantic view that is in accordance with this kind of approach. But
yeah, that's cool. Okay,
yeah,
thanks.
Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Don, for the question. Tadeusz for answering. Next up, we have another question from Catalin. Please go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to ask if you have prepared or you have on your mind how a schematic would look like using this basic idea of demonstrative use, because it looks like it cannot be, for example, Kaplan's view, right? Because there now in your examples that I think they were very good examples, we have, for example, demonstrative use for indexicals. So definitely we cannot even split now indexicals and demonstratives. we need to split different in different way the uses of expressions. So do you have already some clear schematics of that, or are you planning to do this?
So yeah, that's thank you for the question. When we are reading the demonstratives, that's I don't know, some people might remember that there is a part of demonstratives when Kaplan is saying something like this, that that a lot of things depend on how we individuate expressions. Okay, so he says something like that at some point, and one way of individuating expression is a kind of a formal way. We say that we have a linguistic forms, and in virtue of a particular form, we are saying that we are dealing with a single expression, right? Other ways say that form and meaning maybe constitute sameness of expressions in a sense. But the way, and I think this way is exactly mentioned in some parts of demonstratives, is that we are rather individuating expressions in terms of uses, okay? So the idea is that you somehow gather up uses of the same kind, and then you just say, let us idealize, and say that a particular expression will be representative of those kinds of uses. And it might be even grounded somehow empirically or justified empirically, because it might happen, it happens actually, that certain kinds of expressions have a dominant kind of use, definitely, or popular or regular kind of use. So you, for instance, you gather together several uses of here or several uses of I, and you say I, let's say in the logic of demonstratives or in the approach to demonstratives, is really an idealization based on those classes of uses. So this is a way in which I would love to think about that. So this is why I said at the end that the logic of demonstratives is the logic of uses. Of course, via this idealization that we might apply here. So this is the way I'd love to think about this issue. But I'm not sure if that addresses your question.
No, it addresses. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks for the question.
All right, thanks so much, Katalin, for the question, and Tadek for answering. I actually had a bit of a follow-up. This is somewhat of a half-baked question, but I think it's a follow-up to Dan's and Katalin's question. I was wondering something like this. The main upshot of Quentin Smith's move, and of course you're critical with respect to it, but largely you endorse it, is to switch from a typology of expressions into indexicals and demonstratives to a typology of uses of expressions, right? And I can see that there's a practical basis for that. So if Richard III says, you know, the character now is the winner of our discontent, presumably the now in question is something that pertains not just to the discourse reference to the moment of time, but also to something that Richard's been waiting for a long time, to something that connects with the Civil War at play and so on. Presumably that would seem to import some kind of descriptive content into the use of the word now, and that seems to sort of be some kind of grist to your mill, right? And to your and Quentin Smith's mill. Okay, good. But I guess my question was far broader and in some sense, hopefully methodological. I was wondering, beyond this kind of purchase on specific cases, what the theoretical benefit of switching from a typology of expressions to typology of uses of expressions is. So for instance, since you've very nicely quoted Kaplan, somebody might say, okay, let's just individuate expressions differently. And then we could get by with the typology of expressions instead of one of uses of expressions, right? So in some sense, how is this question substantive or meaty or deep so that it couldn't be sort of gimmicked by a re-individuation of expressions or something like that. I'm not sure if the question makes sense, but in some sense, just thinking of Quentin Smith's suggestion more broadly, what is the in your by your lights, what is the main theoretical benefit of that? What does it get us that we couldn't possibly theoretically get otherwise just as well? Right, that's a sort of general purport of this. So thanks so much.
Yes, thanks for the question. So one thing, and that will be a kind of quick answer, but probably not deep enough to somehow address all the issues that are behind your question, is of course that it's fruitful, right? And it's fruitful because it applies to the analysis of cases I have given, right? So that's one way to go, okay? Say, think about this in that manner. It will help us to solve certain puzzles and show how we can analyze it. And the two puzzles, the case of the understanding machine puzzle and the cases of some cases of non-standard uses of Y, I used as the example, right? So that's one way to go. But the question to you is, would you be satisfied by this kind of justification of this kind of use directed approach, or would you require something more of the justification of this kind of way of thinking about the issues? Because that's a kind of let's say quick and quick answer to your worry.
Correct me if I'm wrong, please, and I'm just going to abuse my privilege as a chair and ask a follow-up to my own question. But it seems to me as though so part of your rejoinder sounds as if you're asking me if I were satisfied to a difference in types of uses instead of an ambiguity, semantically speaking. And some people would be satisfied with that kind of exots, some people wouldn't. The general methodological question would be sort of why go one way rather than another, and why do that specifically for indexicals/demonstratives. Yeah, I'm just wondering if you have some general, let me use this kind of fancy word, meta-methodological thoughts on the issue.
Yeah, that's a very good question, but also it's a very difficult question. So if we will say that fruitfulness is not the something that would justify the general methodological trend I want to defend, right? Because fruitfulness, of course, applies to particular distinctions, not necessarily to some general spirit of the proposal, so to speak. So of course of course here I think that the justification might somehow appeal to some philosophical and methodological assumptions that are close to my heart, so to speak. Okay, and I'm I'm quite convinced that other people might not share them. I mean, this is a kind of this is an obvious thing for me. So the justification would be probably just by saying that there is something deeply correct, and of course this is a kind of rhetoric manipulation by a code when I'm calling something deeply correct here, okay, about thinking about language as a tool in general, okay, that is simply used on particular occasions, and studying various kinds of uses as a kind of a right way to think about language as a tool, and as just a tool that is used systematically in communicative actions in general. So I would say that if we'll go in that direction, which is kind of course, not a new one, okay, this is the way of thinking that is present in case of many thinkers like like Wittgenstein, for instance, and Ryle, and many others that we might think of now, then of course attempting to switch from the talking about expressions to talk about the uses seems to be a very natural, I would say, the very honest philosophically way to go. And since this kind of approach is somehow close to my heart in general, so I like this because it's a kind of, seems to me to be a kind of a natural consequence of this kind of seeing things. But I'm not sure if you would say that this is a good justification of this kind of methodological trend or methodological tendency at the end of the day. I'm not sure. So I don't know if that you will find this kind of justification or description of rationale behind this kind of approach satisfying in any sense or in any way. So I'm really curious what you think.
I mean, I for one find it quite persuasive, and I think it's wonderful. I just thought I'd recall this old tradition that, you know, I've learned the word meta semantics, and this is somewhat of a gimmick, but the thought was that this was a branch that this was a field branch, sometimes a field linguistics, sometimes of formal pragmatics, sometimes of other sorts of disciplines, but notoriously not a branch of semantics itself. And so it would have seemed that a typology of uses of expressions a typology of expressions doesn't necessarily follow suit from a typology of uses of expressions. And if that's the case, then the old question of the semantics pragmatics divide is sort of still open. The jury is still out on this, but I find your view quite compelling and interesting, and it seems to move the ball in the other court. So thanks so much for that.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that but let me just stress that I still think that the entire issue is somehow that we cannot directly pass from the typologies or taxonomies or classifications of uses into classifications, typologies or taxonomies of expressions. We cannot do that directly, but I think we can do that by assuming certain idealizations from the general methodological point of view. And maybe this is the way to go. I mean, idealizations in science are necessary, and maybe they should be also applied in philosophy of language as well. Why not? So, yeah.
All right, thanks so much for that, Tadek. And if there are some final questions or rejoinders, this would be the ideal time. And we have one from Don. Please go ahead.
Only if it's okay. Yes, I had a different question, but now I'm kind of like intrigued by your discussion. So I'm going to go with that. So it's basically kind of a follow-up in a way. I'm very skeptical about just relying on use and on types of uses, right? Because, you know, let's assume, again, I'm going to bring the predicates of taste or whatever. Take any expression that people have talked about. Let's say that after extensive empirical research, they have found 3 types of uses. But, you know, there's what some people would call a different type of expression that has exactly the same 3 types of uses. You would still want to say that there are different expressions or type of expressions, right? You know, let's say epistemic models have 2 types of uses and predicates of taste have the same 3 types of uses, but nobody would say that epistemic models and predicates of taste have the same type of expression, right? So there's this kind of, it seems like if you rely only on use, it seems that there's this danger of like losing a little bit sight of the identity of the expression in a way, right? Of type of expressions. So is that something that you're worried about a little bit, or, you know, you were happy to say like, however the sticks may fall in the end, that's how we categorize expressions now?
Yeah, that's a good question. But my impression here is that, of course, I will be now somehow I will trying here to apply certain words which I had regarding the recent debates regarding metaphysics of words, for instance, because the issue somehow arises in that context. So my impression is that when we use such concepts like expression of words, that those expressions are a kind of, well, I will use the term ambiguous because they are kind of ambiguous, and they are ambiguous between, and this ambiguity can be somehow illustrated that when in cases in which we are asking a question, for instance, how many expressions are used in a certain context, then there could be at least two answers to most of those questions, which are both very intuitively correct. Okay, so just if you have, let's say, the expressions that is homonym, let's use, I don't know, the bank, for example, whatever you want, right? So whether in cases in which it's, let's say, used in a single sentence twice, but with two different meanings. So when you ask people a question, is that one expression or two expressions? So some people will give one answer, some people will give another answer. And in a certain sense, both answers are correct. I mean, because you are thinking about the idea of expression in a different manner. So so my impression is here that in the examples that you were trying here to provide was somehow this ambiguity, this intuitive ambiguity between the meaning of word and meaning expression plays a kind of a role, because some people might hesitate to say that we are having two expressions because they are using the term expression in one sense. But some other people might be very happy to say that this story looks completely different, okay, because we are dealing here with two expressions, really, right?
I mean, I agree with the case you've given, but we're still talking here about at least something is common, namely the the phonetical form. But when you have a predicate of taste like tasty and an epistemic model like might, there's not even that, and it's just this. There's just the possibility in your view that they might end up assuming that experimental findings, blah blah blah, they might end up being, because they have the same use, being the same type of expression, and that's it's hard to swallow. I'm not saying that you can't, because there's always debates like, is this a epistemic model? Is this blah blah blah? Right. So we don't know, but assume two types of expressions that everybody agrees that they're different. Still, in relation to those, according to your view, you might end up conflating them. Yeah. But so no, but I understand what you're saying. I mean, all these issues about metaphysics of the world, that's completely legit. Yes.
Yeah, but the case of epistemic models, model expressions is excellent example as well, I would say. It's a kind of, yeah, I do want to say that when we use might, for instance, and let's say we have an obvious epistemic use, and let's say we have an obvious modal use, I mean, analytically modal use, right? Do you want to have that we are dealing with two expressions or one expression? I mean,
there's various views, right?
Yeah, definitely. But I would probably say, maybe the inclination would be to say that we are really dealing maybe with two different expressions. But the kind of, it's maybe the applicability of the idea of identification of expression somehow based on the identification of uses must go in that way. That if you are sensitive to uses, then you must somehow bite the bullet and say that even in cases in which people will protest, those are different expressions. So maybe that's the way you have to go, and somehow you have to be strong and resistant to criticism of various sorts. Maybe.
Okay. Be strong, Tadeusz. Okay, thanks. Sorry.
Such a wonderful conclusion to this evening. Thanks so much to Professor Ciecierski, and thanks so much to everyone in attendance. And I'm sure everyone joins me once more in thanking Tadek for a fantastic talk and a fantastic Q&A. And very much looking forward to the next installments of CELFIS, because this really sets a standard. Thanks, Tadek. Have a good day.
If I might add something to
yes, please go ahead.
Very briefly. So I would like to thank you for your presence and questions and the feedback I received. So thank you a lot, and I find it extremely inspiring, and that would extremely help me in developing the further ideas connected with that. So thank you a lot. Thank you very much for invitation, for being here and discussing those issues with me.
And we're so very grateful. Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Cheers.